A black boy saves millionaire from a car accident. The next day, a luxury car parks at his house. Heavy raindrops pelted Emmanuel's face as he pedaled through the darkened streets of the city. His worn jacket, already soaked through, clung to his thin frame, but he barely noticed. After months of late-night deliveries, the 14-year-old had grown accustomed to the discomfort. His skinny legs kept pushing the pedals, while his bright eyes scanned the road ahead through the misty curtain of rain. As he passed through the wealthy neighborhood, brilliant light spilled from large windows of mansions, creating shimmering pools of gold in the puddles below. Emmanuel's thoughts drifted to his own small home, where his mother Linda waited with his younger brother Malik. She was probably still awake, counting every meager penny to pay their debts, while Malik slept soundly on their old bed. The world isn't fair, but you must still do what's right. His mother's words echoed in his mind, bringing a slight smile to his face. Emmanuel felt no envy toward those living in these luxurious houses. His father had taught him that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they owned, but by what they did. And tonight, no matter how heavy the rain, Emmanuel had to complete his deliveries. It was the only way he could help his mother, and hope that someday, Malik wouldn't have to cycle through storms like this. Thunder rolled in the distance, like a warning of things to come. Emmanuel tightened his grip on the handlebars, increasing his pace. He couldn't have known that tonight. Fate would place a far greater responsibility on his shoulders than the packages he carried. A responsibility that would change not only his life, but the lives of others, in ways he could never have imagined. The night air shattered, with the screech of tires against wet pavement. Emmanuel's head snapped up at the sound, just in time to witness a black luxury sedan swerving wildly ahead. The car's headlights carved erratic patterns through the rain as it spun out of control, metal guardrail crumpling like paper beneath its weight. In slow motion, the vehicle breached the barrier and descended into the water-filled drainage ditch below, landing with a thunderous splash that echoed through the empty street. The impact sent ripples across the dark water, now illuminated by the car's submerged headlights. Smoke began to rise from the hood, mixing with the misty rain and ghostly swirls. Through the rain-streaked windows, Emmanuel could make out a figure slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. "Someone else will come," a small voice whispered in his mind. But the memory of his father's accident 5 years ago surged forward, drowning out all other thoughts. The rain intensified, drumming against the pavement, as if marking the seconds ticking away. A piece of the car's bumper floated to the surface, followed by a spreading rainbow sheen of oil. The water level in the ditch was rising steadily, already reaching the bottom of the car's windows. From the hood, the smoke had grown thicker, carrying the acrid scent of burning wire and metal. Emmanuel's bicycle clattered to the ground. As he moved toward the ditch, his feet seemed to move on their own accord, splashing through puddles and sliding on the muddy slope. Behind him, his delivery packages sat forgotten in the basket, protected from the rain by plastic wrapping. The night had transformed from a simple delivery route into something far more critical, and Emmanuel knew that every second could mean the difference between life and death. The water in the ditch was surprisingly cold as Emmanuel made his way down the muddy bank. Each step had to be carefully placed. One wrong move could send him sliding into the deepening water. The car had settled at an angle, its front end dipping lower than the rear, and through the rain-streaked windows, he could make out the silhouette of a man slumped over the steering wheel. "Hello?" Emmanuel called out, his voice almost lost in the gentle drumming of rain. "Can you hear me, sir?" The only response was a faint groan, and the quiet gurgle of water slowly filling the car's interior. The smoke from the hood had grown thicker, carrying a faint scent of burning oil that had made his heart beat faster. Testing the door handle, Emmanuel found it locked. He looked around, eyes scanning the ground until they settled on a piece of broken concrete near the guardrail. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. The rough surface scraped against his palms as he lifted it, its weight unfamiliar in his hands. "Please move away from the window if you can hear me," he called out again, though he doubted the man was conscious enough to respond. Taking a deep breath, Emmanuel struck the driver's side window. The impact sent a jarring sensation up his arms, but the glass only spiderwebbed. He struck again and again, each hit sending sharp pains through his hands, until finally, the window gave way with a soft, tinkling sound. The rush of cold air seemed to rouse the man slightly. In the dim light, Emmanuel could see he was older, perhaps in his 50s, wearing what had once been an expensive suit. A thin trail of blood ran down his temple from a cut on his forehead. "Sir?" Emmanuel reached through the broken window, careful to avoid the sharp edges. "We need to get you out of here." His fingers found the seatbelt release, but it was jammed, probably damaged in the impact. The water was rising steadily now, already reaching the bottom of the window. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "What? Who?" he mumbled, his words thick and slurred. "I'm Emmanuel, sir. Your car went off the road. We need to get you out before—" A sharp crackling sound from the engine cut him off, followed by a wisp of darker smoke. The acrid smell grew stronger, making Emmanuel's eyes water. Working faster now, Emmanuel pulled at the seatbelt, trying every angle he could think of. His hands were trembling, partly from cold and partly from fear, but he forced them to be steady. The water continued to rise, now halfway up the window, soaking his sleeves as he worked. "My briefcase," the man muttered, reaching weakly for the passenger seat. "Important papers." "Those can be replaced, sir," Emmanuel said gently but firmly. "You can't." Something in his tone must have reached through the man's confusion, because he stopped moving and focused on Emmanuel's face for the first time. Just then, the seatbelt finally gave way under Emmanuel's persistent efforts. But as he tried to help the man move, a cry of pain stopped them both. "My arm," the man gasped. "I think it's broken." Emmanuel could see now that the man's right arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and his legs seemed trapped under the crushed dashboard. The rising water had reached the man's chest, its cold touch seeming to bring him more alert, even as it added to their danger. Working carefully but quickly, Emmanuel helped free the man's legs, trying to cause as little pain as possible. Each movement was accompanied by sharp intakes of breath and barely suppressed groans. The rain continued to fall around them, creating a gentle backdrop to their struggle. A sudden pop from the engine made them both jump. Orange flames flickered briefly under the hood, visible even through the thickening smoke. They were running out of time. "Sir, this is going to hurt," Emmanuel warned softly, "but we have to move now." The man nodded grimly, understanding the urgency in Emmanuel's voice. With careful movements, Emmanuel positioned himself to help the man through the window, mindful of his broken arm. It was like lifting a wet sandbag. The man's waterlogged clothes made him even heavier than his size suggested. Emmanuel's muscles trembled with the effort, but he refused to give up. Inch by inch, they worked together until the man was finally free of the car. The climb up the muddy bank was another battle entirely. Emmanuel positioned himself under the man's good arm, taking as much weight as he could. Their feet slipped in the mud with every step, the earth itself seeming to fight against their escape. Emmanuel's legs burned with effort, but he kept moving, kept supporting, kept hoping each step would be the last. Just as they reached level ground, a sharp crack echoed through the night. Emmanuel looked back to see flames finally breaking free from under the car's hood, their orange glow reflecting off the water's surface. The heat reached them, even through the rain, a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Without hesitation, Emmanuel shrugged off his delivery jacket, the one his mother had saved for months to buy him, and wrapped it around the shivering man's shoulders. It was too small, of course, but it was something against the cold rain. The man, who Emmanuel would later learn was Mr. Charles, sagged against him, watching the flames with a mixture of shock and disbelief. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear now as they turned to Emmanuel. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Wow, you don't even know me." Emmanuel adjusted his grip to better support the injured man's weight, considering the question. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and in the distance, He could hear the first sirens approaching. Looking at Mr. Charles, Emmanuel saw not a wealthy businessman in a ruined suit, but simply another human being who had needed help. Because, he said quietly, everyone deserves someone who stops. The simplicity of the answer seemed to strike Mr. Charles deeply, and for a moment they stood in silence, the rain falling softly around them, two strangers connected by an act of pure kindness. The flames from the fire cast flickering shadows across their faces as they waited for help to arrive, each lost in their own thoughts about how quickly life could change and how the smallest decisions could have the biggest impact. So, standing in the gentle rain, Emmanuel felt Mr. Charles growing heavier against his shoulder. The older man's expensive suit, now soaked and muddy, hung limply from his frame. Blood from his injured arm had begun to seep through Emmanuel's makeshift bandage, creating a thin crimson trail that mixed with the rainwater running down his sleeve. "We need to find help," Emmanuel said softly, adjusting his grip to better support Mr. Charles's weight. The rain had eased to a fine mist, transforming the streetlights into hazy halos in the darkness. Through these pools of light, Emmanuel could see the increasing pallor of Mr. Charles's face, the way his breathing had become shallow and labored. A weak groan escaped Mr. Charles's lips as he tried to straighten himself. "My phone," he mumbled, his words slightly slurred. "In the car." His voice trailed off as he glanced back at the wreckage, where small flames still flickered, despite the rain. Emmanuel scanned the quiet street. His bicycle lay forgotten near the guardrail, the delivery packages in his basket still waiting patiently. In the distance, through the misty rain, he could make out the faint glow of what might be a gas station or convenience store. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best hope. "There's a light about half a mile ahead," Emmanuel said, his voice gentle but determined. "If we can make it there, we can get help." He carefully adjusted Mr. Charles's uninjured arm across his shoulders, trying not to jostle the broken one. The blood was flowing more freely now, the bandage becoming more saturated with each passing minute. Mr. Charles's eyes, clouded with pain, met Emmanuel's. There was something vulnerable in his gaze, a trust that seemed to have formed in the chaos of their shared ordeal. "Why aren't you afraid?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft patter of rain. Emmanuel thought of his father, of dark roads, and passing cars that never stopped. "Sometimes," he replied quietly, "being afraid isn't as important as doing what needs to be done." He felt Mr. Charles' good hand tighten slightly on his shoulder in response. Together, they took their first tentative step toward the distant light. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Emmanuel had made his choice. As they moved slowly through the misty rain, he sent up a silent prayer that Mr. Charles would have the strength to make it. The rain fell harder now, each drop feeling like tiny needles against Emmanuel's exposed skin as he struggled forward, with Mr. Charles's weight on his back. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning that illuminated their desperate journey in brief, haunting snapshots. The man's labored breathing, near Emmanuel's ear, kept time with their slow, painful progress along the rain-slicked street. "Hold on, Mr. Charles," Emmanuel whispered, more to himself than to the injured man. "Just hold on, a little longer." His sneakers, completely soaked through, made squelching sounds with every step. The water had long since penetrated the worn canvas, turning each movement into a battle against both weight and discomfort. Emmanuel's legs trembled with exhaustion, muscles burning from supporting the combined burden of Mr. Charles and the relentless pull of gravity. Yet he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. The memory of his father's accident drove him forward, each step a silent promise to not let history repeat itself. A car's headlights suddenly cut through the rain, and Emmanuel's heart leaped with hope. He tried to wave with one hand, while keeping Mr. Charles steady, his voice cracking as he called out, "Please, please stop, we need help." The vehicle slowed slightly, and for a moment Emmanuel thought they might finally get assistance. But then, A man's voice cut through the darkness. "Get away, kid!" The car accelerated, spraying dirty water over them as it passed, leaving Emmanuel standing there, water dripping down his face, mixing with the tears he couldn't hold back anymore. "Wait," he whispered into the rain. Why won't anyone help?" The weight of societal indifference had pressed down on him, even harder than Mr. Charles' unconscious form. His mother's words echoed in his mind, clear as the day she'd first spoken them. "The world isn't fair, Emmanuel, but you must always do what's right." Another flash of lightning revealed the desolate street ahead, puddles growing into small lakes. As the storm intensified, Emmanuel adjusted his grip on Mr. Charles, feeling the man's warm blood seeping through the makeshift bandage and onto his own shoulder. The contrast between the cold rain and warm blood made him shudder, but it also strengthened his resolve. He took another step forward, then another. His foot slipped in the mud, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought they would both fall. Emmanuel somehow managed to keep his balance, but the sudden movement caused Mr. Charles to groan in pain. "I'm sorry, Bishaw," Emmanuel gasped, steadying himself. "I'm sorry. I'm trying to be careful." Mud splattered across his face, getting into his eyes, but he couldn't spare a hand to wipe it away. The grit mixed with the rain, creating a stinging sensation that added to his misery. More cars passed, their headlights cutting through the darkness like accusing eyes. Some slowed down, but none stopped. Emmanuel could see the faces inside, illuminated briefly by streetlights, faces that turned away, pretending not to see the struggling boy and the injured man. Each rejection felt like a physical blow, but Emmanuel refused to let it break him. "This isn't right," he muttered, echoing his mother's frequent observations about the world. "People should help each other. That's what makes us human." His words were lost in the sound of rain and traffic, but saying them out loud helped him keep moving. The weight on his back seemed to grow heavier with each step. Mr. Charles had fallen silent again, which worried Emmanuel more than the groaning had. He could still feel the man's chest rising and falling against his back, but the movement seemed weaker, more irregular. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Emmanuel flinched, but kept his footing. The storm was getting worse, and they were still so far from help. His legs felt like lead, and his shoulders screamed in protest. But he couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. A particularly strong gust of wind drove the rain sideways, stinging Emmanuel's face like tiny shards of glass. He turned slightly, trying to shield Mr. Charles from the worst of it. The man had already lost too much blood. The last thing he needed was to get chilled through. Emmanuel's foot caught on something hidden beneath the water, a branch or piece of debris, and this time he couldn't catch himself in time. They went down hard, landing in a puddle that was deeper than it looked. Water rushed into Emmanuel's nose and mouth, tasting of mud and motor oil. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd lost his grip on Mr. Charles, but his hands had somehow maintained their hold. Struggling to his knees, Emmanuel coughed up dirty water, his whole body shaking with cold and exhaustion. "Get up," he told himself firmly, his mother's voice mixing with his own in his head. "Get up! You have to get up!" Another car approached, and Emmanuel didn't even bother looking up this time. He focused instead on getting back to his feet, on making sure Mr. Charles was secure on his back once more. The splash of water as the car passed told him all he needed to know about humanity's capacity for indifference. But then, his mother's words came back to him again, stronger this time. "You must always do what's right, not because others would do the same, not because it was easy, or because you'd be rewarded. You did it because it was right, and that was enough." Emmanuel straightened up, adjusting Mr. Charles's weight once more. His legs shook with fatigue, and his back felt like it was on fire, but he started moving again. One step, another step, each one, a small victory against the storm, against the darkness, against the indifference of the world around them. "My father," Emmanuel whispered to Mr. Charles, Though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him, he was in an accident too. Nobody stopped to help him. They all just drove by, just like tonight. His voice caught in his throat, but he forced himself to continue, the words helping to keep his feet moving. He died alone on the road. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to anyone else if I could help it. So, I'm not giving up on you, Mr. Charles. I'm not letting you die tonight. The rain continued to pour, creating rivers in the gutters that threatened to sweep them both away. Emmanuel's world narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. Step, breathe, step, breathe. The pattern became a rhythm, a heartbeat pushing him forward through the storm. I'll pick him. His muscles screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Mr. Charles's life depended on him reaching help. The man's breathing had grown more labored, and the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage seemed endless. Emmanuel could feel his own strength ebbing away with each step, but he refused to give in to exhaustion. Another flash of lightning revealed something ahead, a gas station, its fluorescent lights creating a halo in the rain. Emmanuel's heart leaped at the sight, but he forced himself not to rush. The ground was too treacherous, and one wrong step now could doom them both. Almost there, he gasped, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Mr. Charles or himself. Just a little further. We're going to make it. We have to make it. The distance to the gas station seemed to stretch endlessly, but Emmanuel kept moving. Each step brought them closer to safety, closer to help. He thought about his mother, about how she'd taught him to be strong, to do what was right, even when it was hard. He thought about his father, alone on that dark road years ago. He thought about Mr. Charles, whose life now quite literally rested on his shoulders. The world had failed his father that night, but Emmanuel refused to fail Mr. Charles. Sometimes he realized one person doing the right thing was enough to make a difference. Sometimes that was all it took to change someone's world. Thunder rolled overhead, but Emmanuel barely heard it. His focus was entirely on reaching the gas station, on the promise of help that lay ahead. Then, just a few more steps, just a little further, they were going to make it. They had to make it, because in this moment, on this rain-soaked street, Emmanuel wasn't just carrying Mr. Charles, he was carrying hope. Hope that people could be better. Hope that doing the right thing mattered. Hope that one person's choice to help could make all the difference in the world. Mr. Charles stirred against Emmanuel's back, his breathing changing from shallow unconsciousness to sharp awareness. Emmanuel felt the man's muscles tense suddenly, followed by a weak but desperate attempt to push away. What are you doing? Mr. Charles' voice was hoarse, trembling with a mixture of pain and suspicion. Who are you? Are you stealing from me? The accusation hit Emmanuel like a physical blow. He carefully lowered Mr. Charles to rest against a wall, under a small awning, where the rain couldn't reach them. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across their faces as they faced each other for the first time since the accident. If I wanted your money, Emmanuel said, unable to keep the hurt and anger from his voice, I'd have left you in that car. His hands were shaking, partly from exhaustion and partly from emotion. I've been carrying you for almost an hour, trying to find help. Mr. Charles's eyes narrowed, scanning Emmanuel's face with obvious distrust. Why? Why would you help me? What do you want? Emmanuel sat back on his heels, the rain running down his face, masking the tears that threatened to fall. Not everyone has an angle, Mr. Charles. Sometimes people just help because it's the right thing to do. The right thing? Mr. Charles laughed, but it was a bitter sound that turned into a cough. Young man, I've lived long enough to know there's no such thing as pure altruism. Everyone wants something. Emmanuel looked away, his gaze distant. The rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but steady. My father died in an accident 3 years ago. It was a night just like this. Raining, dark. His car went off the road. Emmanuel's hands clenched into fists. People drove by. They must have seen him, but no one stopped. No one helped. By the time someone finally called an ambulance, it was too late. Mr. Charles' expression softened slightly, but the suspicion didn't leave his eyes. "I'm sorry about your father, but that doesn't explain." "I won't let it happen again," Emmanuel interrupted, his voice fierce despite its softness. "I won't let someone else die alone on the road, just because people are too busy or too afraid to help. I won't let your family feel what my family felt." A long silence followed, broken only by the steady drumming of rain and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Mr. Charles studied Emmanuel's face, as if searching for some sign of deception. "You remind me of someone," Mr. Charles said finally, his voice gentler than before. "My brother, when we were young. He always wanted to help people too." A shadow passed across his face. "But people change. They show their true colors eventually." Emmanuel waited, sensing there was more to the story. Mr. Charles closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the wall. "Oh, my brother, he was the one person I trusted completely. We built our business together, worked side by side for 20 years. Mr. Charles's voice cracked slightly. "Then one day, I discovered he'd been embezzling money for years. He'd been stealing from me, from our employees, from our future." "I'm sorry," Emmanuel said softly, "but not everyone will betray you. Some people really do just want to help." Mr. Charles opened his eyes, looking at Emmanuel with a mixture of weariness and wonder. "How do you do it? How do you still believe in people after what happened to your father?" Emmanuel thought about it for a moment, remembering his mother's words. "Because giving up on people means giving up on hope. And without hope, what's the point of anything?" A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating them both. Mr. Charles winced at the light, and Emmanuel noticed fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on his arm. "We need to keep moving," Emmanuel said, already preparing to help Mr. Charles up. "You're still bleeding. We need to find help." "Wait," Mr. Charles said, reaching out with his good arm to grasp Emmanuel's wrist. I apologize for what I said earlier about stealing from me. I've spent so many years expecting the worst from people, I forgot how to see the best." Emmanuel managed a small smile. "It's okay. I understand. But right now, we need to focus on getting you help. Do you think you can stand?" Mr. Charles nodded, though his face was pale with pain. As Emmanuel helped him to his feet, the older man said quietly, "Tell me about your father. What was he like?" As they began their slow journey again, Emmanuel shared stories about his father, his laugh, his love of old movies, the way he always helped neighbors fix their cars. Mr. Charles listened, occasionally sharing his own memories of better times with his brother, before greed and betrayal tore them apart. The rain continued to fall, but something had shifted between them. The suspicion had melted away, replaced by a fragile trust, born of shared pain and understanding. They were no longer strangers, thrown together by circumstance, but two people connected by their experiences of loss and their struggle to maintain faith in humanity. "Your father would be proud of you," Mr. Charles said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "Not many people would do what you're doing tonight." Emmanuel felt his throat tighten. I hope he knows I learned from him about helping people, about doing what's right, even when it's hard." "He knows," Mr. Charles said softly. "Somehow, I think he knows." They continued their journey through the rain, two souls finding connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. Their conversation had bridged more than just physical distance. It had crossed the gap between generations, between experiences, between hope and cynicism. Their newfound understanding was soon tested. As the storm intensified and Mr. Charles's condition began to deteriorate, Emmanuel noticed the blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on Mr. Charles's arm had grown alarmingly dark and heavy, the white shirt now completely stained crimson. Just need to rest a moment, Mr. Charles mumbled, his words becoming increasingly slurred. His face had taken on an ashen color that made Emmanuel's heart race with worry. No, Mr. Charles, we can't stop now, Emmanuel said, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. You're losing too much blood. We need to keep moving. He could feel the older man's body temperature dropping, despite the humidity of the rain-soaked night. Through the curtain of rain, Emmanuel spotted a small bridge ahead. Under normal circumstances, it would have been their quickest route to help, but tonight the rising water had turned it into a treacherous crossing. The normally gentle stream beneath had become a raging torrent, its waters rising dangerously close to the bridge's surface. There's a bridge ahead, Emmanuel said, more to keep Mr. Charles conscious than anything else. If we can cross it, we'll be much closer to the hospital. Mr. Charles nodded weakly, his head lolling against Emmanuel's shoulder. You're a good one, he whispered. Like my brother, before. Stay with me, Mr. Charles, Emmanuel urged, carefully starting across the bridge. The water swirled around their ankles, its pull already strong enough to make Emmanuel's steps uncertain. Tell me more about your brother, about the good times. But Mr. Charles had fallen silent again, his breathing shallow against Emmanuel's neck. The rain pelted them relentlessly, as Emmanuel fought to maintain his footing on the submerged bridge. Each step was a battle against the current, which grew stronger as they neared the middle of the crossing. Suddenly, a surge of water caught Emmanuel off guard. His foot slipped on the slick surface, and for a heart-stopping moment, they both began to fall toward the churning water. Emmanuel's exhausted muscles screamed in protest as he tried to regain his balance. Then, just as all seemed lost, he felt Mr. Charles's uninjured arm tighten around him. Despite his weakness, despite his own pain, the older man was using what little strength he had left to help steady them both. I've got you, son, Mr. Charles gasped, the effort clearly costing him dearly. We'll make it together. Emmanuel felt tears mixing with the rain on his face. This man, who had initially suspected him of theft, was now trusting him with his life, and even trying to protect him in return. The moment forged a bond between them, stronger than words could express. With renewed determination, Emmanuel straightened up, adjusting his grip on Mr. Charles. Thank you, he whispered. Just hold on a little longer, please. They made their way across the remainder of the bridge, inch by inch, their progress slow but steady. The water continued to rise, but they moved as one now, each supporting the other, through the treacherous crossing. When they finally reached the other side, Emmanuel's legs were trembling with exhaustion, but his spirit felt stronger than ever. We made it, Mr. Charles, he said, turning his head to check on the older man. But Mr. Charles had fallen unconscious again, his face now frighteningly pale in the dim light. The blood-stained shirt around his arm was completely soaked through, and his skin felt cold to the touch. No, Emmanuel muttered, carefully lowering Mr. Charles to check his pulse. It was there, but weak and irregular. Please hold on. We're so close now. Please don't give up. The trust that had grown between them made the situation even more desperate. This was no longer just about saving a stranger. It was about saving someone who had shown him that trust and kindness could exist, even in the darkest moments. Someone who, despite his own pain and fear, had reached out to help when Emmanuel needed it most. Emmanuel gathered his remaining strength and lifted Mr. Charles once more. The hospital had to be close now. They had come too far, survived too much, to fail now. As he started forward again, Emmanuel whispered a silent prayer, not just for strength to continue, but for the life of the man who had shown him that sometimes trust given freely could be returned in the most unexpected ways. Through the relentless rain, the gas station's fluorescent lights created a beacon of hope. Emmanuel's legs trembled with each step as he approached, his entire body screaming for rest. After carrying Mr. Charles for what felt like endless hours, the older man had grown frighteningly still, his breathing so shallow that Emmanuel had to keep checking, to make sure he was still alive. "Almost there," Emmanuel whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Please hold on. Mr. Charles, please." The station appeared deserted at first glance, but Emmanuel could see movement behind the counter, through the rain-streaked windows. He staggered to the door, his feet feeling like lead weights, and began pounding on the glass with what little strength he had left. "Help!" he called out, his voice cracking. "Please, we need help." Inside, a young man looked up from his phone, startled by the noise. Emmanuel could see the instant suspicion cross his face, two bedraggled figures appearing out of nowhere. In the middle of a storm, wouldn't inspire immediate trust. The clerk hesitated, his hand hovering near what Emmanuel assumed was a panic button. "Please," Emmanuel tried again, desperation making his voice shake. "He's hurt badly. He needs an ambulance." The clerk took a step closer to the door, peering through the glass. Emmanuel could see the internal struggle playing across his face, the natural desire to help, warring with ingrained caution. Then Mr. Charles let out a weak moan, and the clerk's eyes widened as he finally noticed the blood-soaked bandage. "Oh, God," the clerk muttered, quickly unlocking the door. "Bring him in. Bring him in." Emmanuel's legs nearly gave out as he carried Mr. Charles the final few steps into the brightly lit store. The clerk, whose name tag read Mike, quickly cleared a space near the counter. "Careful, careful, Mike said, helping Emmanuel lower Mr. Charles to the floor. "I'm calling an ambulance right now." He grabbed the phone from behind the counter, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed. Emmanuel collapsed next to Mr. Charles, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. The fluorescent lights revealed just how pale Mr. Charles had become, his skin taking on an almost translucent quality. Emmanuel reached out, with shaking hands, to check the bandage again. "They're on their way," Mike announced, kneeling down beside them, with a clean towel in his hands. "Here, let me help with that." He carefully began replacing the soaked shirt around Mr. Charles's arm with the fresh towel. "How long was he out there?" Mike asked, his earlier suspicion completely replaced by concern. "I don't know," Emmanuel answered truthfully, his voice barely above a whisper. "An hour, maybe? 2? It's hard to tell. No one would stop to help us." Mike's face darkened at that. "Jesus, what's wrong with people?" Before Emmanuel could respond, Mr. Charles's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was unfocused at first, then slowly settled on Emmanuel's face. "You," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "You stayed with me all this time." Emmanuel managed a tired smile. "Of course I did. I promised I wouldn't leave you." Mr. Charles' uninjured hand reached out, grasping Emmanuel's with surprising strength. "You saved me," he said, each word seemingly requiring great effort. "I owe you my life." Emmanuel shook his head, tears mixing with the rainwater, still dripping from his hair. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Charles. I just did what anyone should have done." "But they didn't," Mr. Charles insisted, his eyes growing clearer. "They all drove past, but you stopped. You helped. You carried me through this storm." His voice broke slightly. "You showed me that there's still good in this world." The distant wail of sirens cut through the sound of rain, beating against the windows. Mike stood up, moving to guide the paramedics in, but Emmanuel barely noticed. He was focused entirely on Mr. Charles, whose grip on his hand remained steady despite his weakness. "Thank you," Mr. Charles whispered again, his eyes holding Emmanuel's, "for not giving up on me, for proving me wrong about people." The paramedics burst in then, their efficient movements quickly taking over the small space. They worked swiftly, checking Mr. Charles's vitals and preparing him for transport. Emmanuel tried to step back to give them room to work, but Mr. Charles wouldn't let go of his hand. "This boy," Mr. Charles told the paramedics, his voice growing stronger with urgency, He saved my life tonight. He carried me through the storm when no one else would stop. The paramedics glanced at Emmanuel with newfound respect as they carefully lifted Mr. Charles onto the stretcher. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, placed a hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "You did good, kid," she said softly. "Really good." As they wheeled Mr. Charles out to the ambulance, Emmanuel felt the full weight of exhaustion settle over him. He had done it against all odds, through the storm and the darkness and the indifference of others. He had gotten Mr. Charles to safety. "You need a ride home?" Mike asked, still holding the blood-stained towel. "My shift ends in 10 minutes. I can drop you off." Emmanuel nodded gratefully, too tired to speak. He had done what his father would have wanted. What his mother had taught him was right, and in doing so, he had not only saved a life, but had also restored someone's faith in humanity. Perhaps that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. The night after the rescue, Emmanuel trudged home from his evening job at the convenience store, his muscles still aching from carrying Mr. Charles through the storm. The streets were quiet now, puddles reflecting the soft glow of streetlights, the only reminder of last night's downpour. As he turned onto his street, something unusual caught his eye: a sleek black luxury car, parked in front of his modest home. Emmanuel slowed his steps, a mixture of curiosity and caution washing over him. In this neighborhood, such a car was as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. Through the gentle mist that had settled over the evening, he could see someone standing beside the vehicle, a tall figure in what appeared to be an expensive suit. As Emmanuel drew closer, the figure turned, and the streetlight revealed a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, with features that somehow seemed familiar. The man's posture spoke of confidence and privilege, but his expression held something else, a vulnerability that made Emmanuel pause. "Are you Emmanuel?" the man asked, his voice gentle, but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. Emmanuel nodded, stopping a few feet away. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" The man took a step forward, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Charles, Mr. Charles's son." His voice caught slightly on the word father. "I've been waiting to meet you." Emmanuel's eyes widened as he shook Richard's hand, understanding dawning. "How is your father? Is he okay?" A smile spread across Richard's face, warm and genuine. "He's doing well, thanks to you. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery." Richard's eyes studied Emmanuel's face intently. "He told me everything about how you saved him from the car, carried him through the storm, refused to give up, even when everyone else drove past." Emmanuel looked down, suddenly self-conscious. "I just did what anyone should have done." "But that's just it," Richard said softly. "No one else did. You were the only one who stopped, the only one who cared enough to help." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "You didn't just save my father's life, Emmanuel. You gave our family a chance to heal." Emmanuel looked up, surprised by the weight of those words. Richard continued, his eyes glistening in the streetlight. "My father and I, we've been estranged for years. After what happened with my uncle, Dad shut himself off from everyone, including me. He stopped believing in people, in goodness." Richard's voice grew softer. "But what you did, it changed something in him. When I visited him in the hospital, he was different. He talked about you, about how you reminded him of the person he used to be before life made him cynical." Emmanuel shifted uncomfortably, not used to such praise. "I just thought about what I would want someone to do for my family." Richard smiled again, but this time there was a knowing look in his eyes. "Dad told me about your father too, about what happened to him." He placed a gentle hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, but look at how you've turned that pain into something beautiful, into an act of kindness that's brought healing to another family." Emmanuel felt tears pricking at his eyes and blinked them back. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I want to help you and your family, Emmanuel, not as charity and not just as repayment for saving my father. He held up a hand when Emmanuel started to protest. You deserve a chance to pursue your dreams, to create a better life. My father told me you're working to help support your family, that you had to put your education on hold. Richard pressed the envelope into Emmanuel's hands. This will cover your education, all of it. And there's enough to help your mother start that small business she's always dreamed about. He smiled at Emmanuel's shocked expression. Dad's a good listener when he wants to be. He heard everything you told him during that long walk. I can't accept this, Emmanuel stammered, trying to hand the envelope back. It's too much. Richard gently pushed Emmanuel's hands back. You can, and you will. Not because you're looking for a reward, we both know that's not why you helped my father, but because you and your family deserve this opportunity. His voice grew serious. Sometimes, Emmanuel, the world gives us chances to make things right, to balance the scales a little. This is one of those chances. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Emmanuel's other hand. If you ever need anything at all, call me. You're part of our family now, whether you like it or not. Emmanuel stared at the card, then at the envelope, feeling overwhelmed. Richard squeezed his shoulder one last time before turning back toward his car. Remember, Emmanuel, he said, pausing with his hand on the car door. This isn't charity. This is recognition of who you are and what you deserve. Sometimes the world needs reminding that goodness still exists, that one person's choice to do right can change everything. He smiled one last time. You showed my father that. Now let us show you that his renewed faith in humanity wasn't misplaced. As Richard's car disappeared into the night, Emmanuel stood there, holding the envelope and card, feeling as if the world had shifted beneath his feet. He thought about his father, about Mr. Charles, about how one night in the rain had connected their families in ways he never could have imagined. Perhaps, he realized, this was how healing worked, not just for Mr. Charles and his family, but for all of them. Sometimes it took a storm to wash away the past and make room for new beginnings. Emmanuel stepped into his modest home, the envelope and business card feeling warm in his hands. The familiar scent of his mother's cooking filled the air, and he could hear Malik's excited chatter from the kitchen. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. Emmanuel, is that you? His mother called out. You're late tonight. I was getting worried. He walked into the kitchen, where his mother was stirring a pot of soup, and Malik was doing homework at the small table. They both looked up as he entered, their expressions changing to concern when they saw his face. What's wrong? His mother asked, wiping her hands on her apron. You look like you've seen a ghost. Emmanuel shook his head, a smile slowly spreading across his face. No, Mom. Something amazing just happened. He pulled out a chair and sat down, placing the envelope and card on the table. Malik immediately abandoned his homework, scooting closer to his brother. What is it? What happened? Emmanuel took a deep breath and began telling them about the encounter with Richard, about Mr. Charles's recovery, about the incredible offer of help. As he spoke, his mother slowly sank into a chair, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. Malik's eyes grew wider and wider, shining with pride and amazement. You really saved his life? Malik whispered, when Emmanuel finished. Like a real hero? Emmanuel ruffled his little brother's hair. I just did what Dad would have done, what Mom taught us to do. His mother reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Your father would be so proud of you, Emmanuel. So proud. She opened the envelope with trembling hands, and when she saw what was inside, She began to cry in earnest. A shop of my own, she whispered. And your education, all these years of dreaming. Emmanuel felt his own eyes growing wet. It doesn't feel real, he admitted. Like I might wake up and find out it was all a dream. Malik jumped up from his chair and hugged Emmanuel fiercely. It's not a dream. My brother is a hero. And now you can go back to school, and Mom can have her shop, and everything is going to be different. Later that night, after his mother and Malik had gone to bed, Emmanuel sat on the front steps of their home. The night was clear now, stars twinkling overhead, so different from the stormy night when everything had changed. He held Richard's business card in his hands, turning it over and over, watching how it caught the light from the street lamp. Maybe I can dream bigger for my family, he whispered to himself, the words carrying both hope and determination. The weight of responsibility he'd carried for so long felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more like a foundation he could build upon, rather than a burden holding him down. The next morning, Emmanuel rode his bike along the familiar route to work, the same streets, the same houses, but everything felt different. As he passed through the wealthy neighborhood, with its grand houses and manicured lawns, he didn't feel the usual pang of distance and separation. Instead, each gleaming window and pristine garden seemed to whisper of possibilities. He thought about Mr. Charles, about Richard, about how a single night could bridge worlds that seemed so far apart. The morning sun caught the windows of a nearby mansion, sending sparkles of light dancing across his path. Yesterday, those lights might have reminded him of everything his family couldn't have. Today, they felt like beacons, guiding him toward a future he was finally allowed to imagine. Emmanuel pedaled harder, feeling the wind against his face, carrying him forward. The boundary between his world and theirs didn't seem so insurmountable anymore. Not because he wanted their wealth or their status, but because he had learned that humanity, kindness, and opportunity could cross any divide. As his bike crested the hill, Emmanuel paused for a moment, looking back at the path he'd traveled. The morning light painted everything in shades of gold and promise, and he could feel his father's memory, like a warm hand on his shoulder. We're going to make it, Dad, he whispered. We're going to make you proud, Ben. Then he turned forward again and continued on his way, riding not just toward work, but toward all the possibilities that now lay before him and his family. The future stretched out like an open road, and for the first time in a long time, Emmanuel felt ready to explore every inch of it.